that's all the housekeeping to start. Let me share my screen and I'll start presenting. All right, so this notion of making success possible in our complex world, as soon as I sort of brought this up last week, somebody actually said that's a really ambiguous topic. And it is a bit ambiguous, right? It's a bit ambiguous. So what does it mean? So here's the purpose of the session. So we all know that it's incredibly stressful when we're tasked with solving these wicked and complex problems. Wicked, really, we have a lot of stakeholders to satisfy. Complex, I'll talk about what complex means in a little bit. And we're also using some kind of product that we don't know if it's a good fit or not for the problems we're solving. So want to really focus on how we can reduce that stress. To do that, we're going to explore complexity and what it takes to deal with it. And, this is all very theoretical to start, but towards the end of the presentation, I'll give you some concrete techniques that you can use within your own organization, first of all, to create the kind of teams that are adaptable, high performing, and very resilient to adversity, because really, that's the fundamental part of this. We all know that as people, we're the ones creating the solutions to these problems. It's all about how we work together and how we handle adversity and what is being thrown at us as we're trying to solve complex problems. And then some techniques for how those teams can generate value by creating adaptive solutions for the complex problems. So that's the purpose of the session. Now, I just want to start with a little game. And Mark's going to share the link in the chat. This game is called the 5S game. It's only going to take 4 minutes to play, probably less. You're going to be presented with a board that looks like this to start, and there are 4 rounds. Don't give up on the first round. It is very difficult on the first round. It's going to be better if you have a mouse. If you have a trackpad, you can try. You won't get as many of these, but the goal is to click through the tiles from 1 to 50 in 30 seconds, and you get 4 rounds to do it. And the 5 S's, you'll see what those 5 S's. Oh, someone can't hear me properly. Is that true of everyone? Okay.
The audio is coming through okay for me, so I think it's working well. It may just be on their end. If you have the invite and you're having trouble hearing, you actually can call in on telephone lines, so you can look for that too.
Okay, thank you. So please go ahead and play this game. And when you're done, post your round results to the chat. So there are 4 rounds, so something like this. I've got 6, 15, 36, 45. Post to the chat, and then we'll know when most of you are done, and we can move on. And then we're gonna take a look at this game later. So I'm just gonna be quiet and let you play this game called the 5 S's. And if you're just joining the meeting, there is a link in the chat, and if maybe it has to be reposted, but we're just going to start off by playing this game called the 5S game. You can just follow the instructions in the game. It's quite self-evident, but you've got to read the instructions. Okay, so Bizet, you had 339. That you should have one more number. There are 4 rounds to the game. Okay. All right, Kevin, thank you. That looks good. Although you got more the first time than the second time. That's interesting. Okay, thank you, Rocky. That's a good progression. Thanks, Astrid. And Roy, that's very interesting. Jeff, it doesn't surprise me you didn't get 50 at the end. Sorry, that's kind of mean. Okay. Okay, looking good. And for those of you just joining, everybody else is playing this game. We're going to move on once people have played and have gotten the answers. Interesting, 0 for the first time. It's very tricky the first time, isn't it? So we're just playing this game and we're going to move on in about 2 minutes. All right, John. So a lot easier the last time. And Jose, that's interesting. We'll have to talk about that. So, I just saw Amy's. I get the feeling that third round is a bit confusing from a user experience perspective with everything broken up into the squares. So we can talk about that too when we get to that point in the presentation. All right. I'm just gonna move on. I'm hoping that most of you have finished. Okay, so Mark, you're gonna share the game link. Am I okay to move on? Any thumbs up or just let me know? Okay. Okay, let's move on. So you might be finishing the game, but we're going to talk about why we played that game later on in the session. So what I do want to talk about, though, when we talk about complexity and we talk about how do we deal with complexity, I'd like to explore this historical example. So I wasn't alive for this, but John F. Kennedy at Congress proposed that the United States should commit to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Now that's a little bit sexist, but a human being, it would have been nice if he'd said that. But so that's what he said in 1961. And imagine if we'd followed a traditional approach to achieving that goal, which, by the way, is a pretty clear vision, right? So let's talk about how we would do it. And I'm using Winston Royce's paper, the first page of his paper, in which he described this approach that later became known as the waterfall. If we'd started with system requirements and gone to software requirements and then gone through all the way to testing and operations, we would have done that once. And there's a picture of Buzz Aldrin taken by Neil Armstrong on the moon. It would have happened once. Now, I think we all know that it wasn't possible to do that. And so what did NASA do? Well, they already had the Mercury missions running at the time that John F. Kennedy said that. And they had proven that astronauts could fly in space. Now, nobody had been in space for more than 34 hours, but they'd proven that astronauts could fly in space. But what they didn't know, look at all these things they didn't know. Can humans survive weightlessness for 2 weeks? Can 2 spacecraft dock in space? Can we conduct the EVAs, the extravehicular activity? Can we land? Because, with Mercury, they were splashing down in the ocean. How can we land there's no ocean on the moon? There's a lot of radiation, the Van Allen belts, the cosmic radiation, cosmic rays, the radiation from the sun. Can we survive all of that? And what about micrometeoroids that are flying around at high speed? Will they puncture the spacecraft skin? So They actually used a different project called Pegasus, where they launched satellites up to measure the velocity and the impact of those micrometeorites. But they had a lot of problems to overcome, a lot of obstacles to overcome. And so they actually invented the Gemini. I would pronounce it Gemini, but I know they pronounce it Gemini. The Gemini mission, just to answer all of these questions before they could actually send a Saturn V into space with an Apollo crew and have them land on the moon. So it's very interesting that they did that. It wasn't a waterfall approach. It was a much more iterative and incremental approach. And you're right, Mark, there's a lot that they didn't know. And I'll tell you, they knew that they didn't know these things, but there were many things that they didn't know that they didn't know, and they learned as they did these things. So for example, the EVAs, they thought, okay, we've got our spacesuits, we're going to be fine. Well, it turns out that the astronauts became overheated and exhausted, and they had to change the whole parameters of the EVA missions. And Mitten's saying it's incredible that it all worked. It is incredible that it all worked so quickly, right? So this is my inspiration for talking about complexity and talking about the way I like to coach Agile teams. And I think that the way that Agile organizations could work. So I'm going to use here a couple of different models. I'm using them a little bit inappropriately, but I'll explain why in a second. Not inappropriate, just simplifying them a little bit. The chart on the left is the basis for what's known as the Stacey complexity matrix, or the Stacey complexity model. So if you think of the y-axis as requirements, whether they're close to agreement, which is very close to the vertex, up to far from agreement, and then on the x-axis, technology, close to certainty, far from certainty, and then the people. Are the people involved in this work that we're doing close to agreement or certainty, or far from agreement and far from certainty? So if you think about being in this corner, we have quite a simple or a clear problem. So we know what our requirements are. We're using technology we've used before. We're all in agreement as to what the objectives of this work are. And so we've got quite a simple or clear problem to solve, right? So I worked, for example, at ExxonMobil in Thailand. There were teams who were implementing payroll changes across the globe. And they were using SAP, and they knew exactly where to make the changes. So they knew the technology. The requirements coming out were quite clear from the different governments around the world as to what needed to change, these deductions changing by a certain amount. And so they knew, and they'd worked together for a while, so they knew exactly what they needed to do. And it was quite a simple and a clear problem. Now, maybe we get into situations that are a little more complicated. For example, I've seen teams recently move from one CRM solution to Salesforce, for example. And nobody really knew Salesforce. They knew what the requirements were because the requirements weren't changing that much. They knew what they needed to do, but they were using a new technology platform. Alternatively, I've also seen teams who had developed payment solutions for certain countries, but they were moving into a new market, a new country. And they didn't know what the requirements for payments were in that new country. And it was actually a more difficult challenge. So in this case, this is usually where we need some kind of expert opinion, and we need to do some analysis to figure out what we need to do. And I'll talk a little bit about how we respond to these kind of problems in the future. Where does complexity fit? Well, it kind of fits here, where we don't really know what we need to build. We don't really know how to build it. And the people on the team don't really know if they're in agreement. This is a complex problem where we have a lot of these unknown unknowns. And I would argue that anyone on this call who's building a product that human beings are going to use is actually solving a complex problem, because we can never figure out how human beings are going to respond to something we give them, right? We just can't do it. There's also something here where if everything is totally far from agreement or far from certainty, we're in this world of chaos. So this is the Stacy complexity matrix in a nutshell, and I know it's very fast, but I'm going to bring over some elements of something called the Cynefin model. Cynefin is a Welsh word for habitat. This model was created by Dave Snowden, and for simple or clear problems, the cause and effect relationship is obvious. We can use a standard practice, and the way we actually handle this is by sensing. We understand that there's a need. We understand that we need to do something. We can categorize it. For example, if we're working in a restaurant, we can categorize this as a drinks order or a food order, and then we can respond based on a standard operating procedure, right? So we can do that. And you know, what happens here is that if we start to apply some of the techniques that we need to apply to complex problems, it's a little bit overwhelming, or it's a little bit it's over-engineered, and it makes people feel and wonder, why are we doing all these things? And I'll talk a little bit about an example of that in a second. For complicated problems, the cause and effect relations are separated. They're not obvious. So I was talking about, you know, using Salesforce for CRM instead of whatever tool we were using. Well, we don't really know how to use Salesforce, but people know how to use it. There are experts out there who can help us understand how to use Salesforce. So we can come up with some different options, good practices. And the way we handle this is by sensing that we have a problem to solve. We can do some analysis, and then based on that analysis, we can respond. And the analysis may result in different options and things like that, but we can respond. Now, when it comes to the complex problems, our cause and effect is retrospectively coherent. I'm going to talk about what that means in a second. This is where we have emergent practices. And this is a totally different approach where we need to probe, sense, and respond. I'm going to talk a little bit more about all of these things in just a little bit, but I do want to talk about chaos. And I use the example, cause and effect are not perceivable. We've never seen anything like this before. It's an acute problem. We have to come up with some new way of figuring out what to do. And instead of probing or analyzing, we just act. We need to act. We need to sense how that action has changed the problem or the problem space. And then based on our understanding of what our action did and how we're sensing whether it worked or not, we can come up with a better response. The example I use for some teams is, what happens if we're in a meeting room and a tiger runs into the room, right? We've never had a tiger run into a meeting room before. And so, you know, Mark might punch the tiger in the nose. I might try to hide under the table. And Jennifer might run out the door. And maybe we'll find out that Jennifer running out the door did the smartest thing that could possibly happen. Yeah, okay, so Mark, it's okay. Maybe, you know, I don't know if anyone would punch the tiger, really. Did anybody see Cocaine Bear, by the way? Because there is some punching of the bear in the Cocaine Bear. So this is where, you know, we do something. And I think early on in COVID, I think we were at this state, right, where we did not know what to do. There was a lot of uncertainty. It was chaos. Somebody just needed to do something. And based on what we learned from the actions that we took as human beings, as governments and things like that, we hopefully came up with a good response, overall response. I'm not going to argue that here today, one way or the other. But so what I will say is that for simple problems, we don't need a methodology. We don't need to sort of organize ourselves around a framework. And for complicated problems where we can figure out what it is we need to do, analyze how to do it, and then respond, that is a perfect place for a more traditional approach like the waterfall, where we can figure out what our requirements are, our needs, figure out how to meet those needs based on our understanding of the sort of, or our reduction of uncertainty because of analysis, and then we can put a plan together and execute on it. Complex problems, though, require this notion of probing, sensing, and responding, and emergent practice. So what does retrospective coherence mean? Well, I'm going to bring our dear friend Steve Jobs into this. I'm not going to let you, or I'm not going to read this to you. You can all read it. Although that second sentence requires trust. And so when we're faced with uncertainty, we have to make decisions and trust that the dots are going to connect sometime in the future. Trust that it's going to work. And what I'd like to talk about today is finding ways that we can trust that the dots will be connected. So that's one thing I'd like to talk about. So what is probing? So the easiest way to explain probing in this context is using an empirical or an experimental approach. And I don't know if anybody is a fan of the Muppets, but poor Beaker that was trying to test paper that was inflammable, supposedly, and it didn't work. But it was a nice experiment, but it sort of reflects what we see on the right there, right? What people think success looks like and what it actually looks like is not the same at all. And for those of us who've been involved in innovation and solving these kind of complex, wicked problems, we know that we get this very, very difficult path to success, and it's very stressful. And this is what I'd like to talk about today. How do we reduce the stress involved in sort of proceeding up that line, because there is, or that curve, because it is extremely stressful. So let's talk about how Scrum deals with this. I think most of you know that, the empirical process in Scrum is supported by 3 pillars: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. In this case, transparency on the left, what do we need to be transparent about? How about everything? How about everything? I once worked at a medical lab company here in Toronto, and I was the team leader of a database team, and there were 3 other team leaders, and there was a manager, and he went away on vacation. And instead of nominating one of us to go to the senior management meeting, they invited all 4 of us to come. And so we started reporting our status to the VPs. And it turned out, as we looked around the room at these VPs whose faces all went pale or were covered in sweat as we started to, that our manager was taking our not so great status reports and turning them green for the sake of his bosses. So we were definitely in that waterfall, or not waterfall, the watermelon kind of mode, right? Green on the outside and red in the middle. And that month changed that manager's life, because he was not being transparent. We were being transparent. And from then on, transparency was expected. These were the days when, oh, this was so terrible. And it may still be happening in your lives. We say, okay, we're going to deliver by July 31st. And everything's green, green, green. And then June 1st or June 7th, all of a sudden, we're not going to deliver until October 31st, right? It's such a terrible feeling. It's such a disservice to everyone in the organization. So there's all sorts of kinds of transparency, but we have to be transparent about everything. And we want to be transparent so that we can inspect what's going on and then adapt our approach based on what's happening. This picture on the right is a broadcasting company that I worked with. The people on the right are members of one of the teams that were solving an advertising sales problem. This problem had existed for 15 years, not solvable, and we put a couple of teams together, and within 2 months the problem was solved. And this reduced the workload of advertising sales and sales associates by such an extreme amount that practically the entire sales team would come to the sprint reviews. And can you imagine how much inspection and adaptation came from having, 80 people, 100 people come to a sprint review and be extremely interested in what you're doing next and what you just did? So this is the kind of inspection and adaptation that we're talking about. And the team on the right, they knew every time they did one of these sprint reviews, there were going to be changes to what they were going to build next, because they would learn a lot from the people doing the review. So that's what we're talking about here. And how do we make this happen? So I want to talk about this, this law of requisite variety, which became known as the first law of cybernetics. And this is an adapted version of it. But this guy, Ross Ashby, a cyberneticist, cybernetics, the study of communications and control based on feedback in biological and artificial systems, big emphasis on comparing the way biological systems would respond and the way artificial systems would respond. But the gist of this law is that the more complex the operational environment, the more diverse the organization needs to be. And in a nutshell, only variety absorbs variety. And this was very interesting to me as I learned about it, because what it means is it's like a first principle of why we have some of the Agile principles and practices that we have today. Instead of thinking about things just as, oh, I read it in the Agile Manifesto, it was a principle, or I read it in the Scrum Guide, this is a first principle about why we need to do some things. And I wanted to talk about a couple of those things. So first of all, whoops, sorry. Before I talk about those things, I want to talk about what requisite diversity might mean in the context of sports. So I was living in Thailand when I first did a version of this presentation, and Aston Villa had just beaten Liverpool 7-2. Now, a lot of Thai people are Liverpool fans, and I brought this in just to sort of make them groan or laugh or hopefully something. And I'm going to bring up a couple of other examples, and I'll talk about what I mean by this in a second. You know, I'm living in Toronto. I'm a Blue Jays fan. Last year, Toronto beat Boston in Fenway Park 28-5. Pretty ridiculous. Then last year, or this year, Liverpool beat Man U 7-0. This is ridiculous for Premiership football or professional football in the UK. Look at this one. Does anybody remember when this happened? When the Seahawks beat the Cardinals 58-0? That's like something else. And then the final one, which is totally ridiculous, was an indoor football game between, I think, Erie and someone else, Chattanooga or something. But they beat, the Erie beat them 38-0. So what's the point here? When it comes to requisite variety, the Blue Jays had an incredible variety of plays and batting. And the Boston Red Sox on that night did not absorb variety with variety. They did not have a variety of response that could handle what the Blue Jays were throwing at them or hitting at them. That's what this means. And so when I think of all the Agile transformations I've been part of and I've seen, we've heard of, many of them fail. And that's because the amount of variety and complexity that our organization and our customers throw at us in the midst of a transformation, if we don't have the type of variety that we need or diversity that we need to handle it, we won't be successful at handling it. So let's talk about some ways that we can be successful at handling these things. So first of all, we need diverse, cross-functional, and self-organizing teams. It's the only way to solve for the variety of complex problems we face. And there are a couple of, one of them is a principle of the Agile Manifesto: the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. I would say that that statement at the top is one of the reasons why this is true. And Scrum teams are cross-functional, meaning that we have all the skills necessary to create value. I would say that the diversity of cross-functional teams is one of the points here, that one of the reasons that we want cross-functional teams. And Dave Snowden, who invented Kneffen says we need a diversity of interpretation of results as we go. We don't want groupthink. We need a diversity of opinion. And one of the things, so as soon as we bring a manager in, or a boss in, or a leader in, and that leader takes a look at maybe how long the team is taking at this point to sort of figure out what these results mean and interpret these results, and says, why are you guys doing all this? It's clear, let's just do this. All of a sudden you've lost all your variety and your diversity. And so this is one of the things that we need to be very cognizant of. And this is why we need to be, why leaders need to learn, because they usually haven't been part of an Agile team in their lives, why they need to learn what it takes to lead an Agile team. And yeah. So here's a diverse team. This is the same team, a couple of teams actually, that were in that previous slide. They decided at Halloween that year to go as a Scrum board. And this was an incredibly diverse team because the organization took, and you can't see it here. I mean, you can see diversity here, right? But there's even more diversity than what's visible in this picture. Some of these people are business people who came from either sales all the way through to the control, like mission control. There are people from vendors here. There are technologists here. There is such a diversity of sort of experience here. And this is the team that started solving these problems in a couple of months that had existed for 15 years. How did they do that? Because, you know, if we think of the Tuckman model, forming, storming, norming, and performing, a lot of storming was expected here. So how did we deal with that storming as it came up? Because we knew it was going to happen. So how did we deal with it? So the first thing is we had this emphasis on psychological safety. So if anybody's seen this, the Project Aristotle from Google, the rework research, you know, they found 5 factors that enabled high-performing teams. But of the 5, psychological safety was by far the most important. That notion of never having any interpersonal fear, being able to express your opinion without ever feeling judged or being judged, to be able to make a decision with the team, knowing that, you know, this decision is not the end of the world and that everybody's comfortable with each other. It's incredibly powerful. And in my experience as a coach, forget all the other Agile practices, forget all the other things. My goal is to help a team or an organization build psychological safety. And if we do that and we're diverse, we can handle anything as long as we're competent in our basic you know, skills and things like our jobs. We can do anything. And even the competence, you know, even the NASA, the operations arm of NASA, when it started, they didn't hire experienced people. They hired people right out of university to be there. So just very interesting. So psychological safety, absolutely important. How do we do it? So I think you've probably seen this in the context of maybe the pyramid and then the right side. That's Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. I don't like calling anything 5 dysfunctions. It's very hard to go into a team and say, hey, we're going to talk about 5 dysfunctions of a team. So what I did was I created this balance on the left to say, when you've got it, here's what things look like. When it's lacking, here's what things look like. And then I actually do retrospectives where we ask people to sort of figure out where are we on this spectrum from the left to the right. So, you know, trust in this case at the bottom is not the kind of predictive trust that comes from knowing somebody for a long time, where, you know, I might know Mark for years, and I know I can trust that he's going to react in a certain way. I may not like that way, but I kind of know how he's going to react. Trust in this case is all about being able to be vulnerable, show our own weaknesses, own up to mistakes, and that's how we build psychological safety. Now, I'm just gonna share some things, some practices that I use as a coach that help build trust. Leading by example. So remember I said I'm kind of nervous talking. I'm in Mark's house. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be nervous when you're here, and it's okay to admit it. And if you keep doing it, I find as an Agile coach, if I keep admitting that I don't know exactly what's going on here, holy cow, that project that Mark and I worked on, we were using AWS EC2 Cloud for the first time ever. I had no idea what was going on, but we all learned together. And oh boy, we were all pretty vulnerable together at that point, trying to figure out what was going on. And it was okay to own up to it. Pair programming. So you're sitting beside a developer you do not know because your team is just formed and you're pair programming. It doesn't get any more vulnerable than that. Why aren't you using the enhanced for loop? What the heck is going on here, right? So let it happen, and let yourself be vulnerable. Admitting blockers. So we talk about the daily scrum. We talk about making sure that we admit blockers or even admitting them anytime during the day. When I was in Thailand, I used to ask people, how long will it be before you admit a blocker? And in general, it was a day. People would say, I'd work on something for a day before I admitted it. And so, we said, well, what if you just admitted it within 15 minutes? See if anybody on the team can help you. Imagine how much that'll accelerate your work, and how now we start to say, okay, I'm admitting blockers. We're all going to help each other solve these problems. So 3 techniques for building trust. The retrospective, the good old retrospective, is great for building trust because we have to be vulnerable in that retrospective, that maybe we're admitting that something went wrong and we want to figure out together how we can fix it. But it's also great for conflict. So high-performing teams need to be very, very comfortable with conflict. Not interpersonal, you're a jerk conflict, but the conflict required to resolve issues and bring up different opinions about how to solve a problem without becoming interpersonal. And I'll tell you, one way that I use and to introduce healthy conflict very early on in my coaching with the team is planning poker and t-shirt sizing. If you facilitate planning poker in a great way, and you start to see that people are groaning or rolling their eyes or not believing somebody, you can coach that team into what those behaviors mean to the person for whom they're rolling their eyes. And you can help them build a great healthy conflict together. Planning poker is an estimation technique. If you want to hang around afterwards, we can talk about it. Backlog refinement is also great. Like, when we come in, a product owner comes in with a bunch of new stories or something, and we start doing backlog refinement, and we start estimating the size of the stories and agreeing on acceptance criteria, we're going to break those stories down. The product owner might say, well, I don't want to eliminate that acceptance criterion from that story. But actually, as we all learn to work together, this is a way for Agile teams to sort of build trust and have healthy conflict. And when it comes to commitment, team planning is fantastic. This is where it's not just the product owner and the scrum master doing the planning, it's the team. And I think we all know that it's more of a design exercise than it is a planning exercise. But let's see how that goes. All right, I know I'm skipping through these things quickly. I'm realizing that I'm gonna run out of time. So let me go on to the next slide. Let's talk about the 5 S's. So if you played the game, you went through the 5 S's, and let's talk about what the S's mean in real life. So first, remember this terrible situation. We have 100 tiles. We have to come up with 1 through 50 in order. That's very exemplary of what happens in our real day work. We've got work coming at us from email, from Slack, on the phone, WebEx. We're not organized. Finding the next thing to work on is tough. So maybe what we do is we sort. Remember, we removed anything above 50 from the board. Makes it easier to find the 1 through 50. I love the word no. And this could be just basic prioritization. Let's say no so that the signal is not lost in the noise. We don't care about the things above 50, so let's just lose them. Let's clear our board. The next one, which, whoops, some people, I know it's maybe not a great visual, but the way it works is that in the different quadrants, like the top left, there's 1 and then 2 and 3 across to the right, and then it goes down. And then once you finish the bottom right, you go back to the top left again and keep going. A little easier to find. Yes, I will share the PowerPoint. So maybe we are doing big room planning and we're figuring out what we're going to do in the next 2 to 3 months. It's not certain, but let's make sure that we've got things kind of organized, right? So these are the things that might come up. But then we talk about standardize. And this is where everybody found it very easy to click through. Oh yeah, Minton, let's talk about it later. Right? It's just this visual representation of straightening and shining. But the last one, I think you'll all agree that on the last one, you got pretty close to 50 if you didn't get 50, right? Because you know exactly where everything is and what's coming up. That's just like having a force rank backlog, right? We all know exactly what's coming up. And so that's standardizing. So let's talk about how, and then we've got to sustain it. So that's the 5th S. You need to have self-discipline. You've got to keep doing this to keep everything standardized. You've got to keep doing it and doing it. It takes a lot of work. So let's talk about Agile meetings. So maybe we do quarterly or big room or program increment planning. Maybe you do that, where we're looking at what might come up in chunks. Now we do backlog refinement. We're creating this force rank backlog, right? And we can change the order just about at any time. And now maybe we do sprint or iteration planning, where we're picking the items that we're going to work on and complete this sprint. So now everybody knows, forget about anything above 10. We know exactly what we're doing for this sprint. And then that leaves our product owner to be able to change the order of anything above 10, because we're not worried about that right now. And then in our daily scrum or our huddle or our Kanban meeting, maybe we're only talking about the ones that we're working on right now. Very limited number. So that's when you think about solving complex problems, what we've just talked about is, let's build a psychologically safe team that is resilient to adversity. Let's give them this approach that simplifies how they organize their work, which makes it easier to sort of think about solving the complex problems, because our approach is quite simple. Now, I want to talk about a technique for shifting left with risk. We always talk about shifting left with testing, right? So we're identifying our test cases up front, and then developing to deliver our tests in a passing state. I call this day Pessimistic Day. Now, I've had people tell me, Dave, that sounds so negative, but it's the only day that you can be negative in an agile effort, or maybe every now and then, right? Similar to a future perspective, where we sort of think about what might, like if we're thinking 6 months from now, or a year from now, our project has failed, or our product has failed to deliver the outcomes that we expected. What went wrong? So we've got to get our initial backlog to a state where it's good enough, where we think that people will be able to understand what our product is going to do and what it's going to be. Then we invite the people that we typically call the troublemakers, the ones who, when we've got everything ready to go, they come in and say, no, you can't go live because of this or this or this, right? Well, that's legal compliance risk. I'm not going to read all of those names out, but you know that these people are the ones who are absolutely necessary in a large organization for us to get agreement to deploy our working software to production in a safe way, a safe and secure way. We need those people. Now, at the end of this deck, there is some guidance on what these people need to think about. We need to give them some visual cues about how to identify the kinds of risks that we're talking about. And so you can see on the top right, There's a little bit of a schedule there of how this works. People are all identifying risks, and you see that they're dot voting. I'm going to talk about the dot votes in a second. And on the bottom, that's the people initially identifying risks. These are all the people that you usually don't meet with until too late in a project to be able to do anything about what they've talked about, right? So we want to meet them early on. So we meet them, we identify the risks, and then what we do is we dot vote. And you know that every risk has probability. How probable is it that this is, how likely is it that this is going to occur? And an impact. What's the degree of negative impact if this risk actually manifests itself? And so what we do is we allow the people, again, and for using Miro or Mural, it's actually great because it can be anonymous. But if we're dot voting, people can dot vote on the risks that they think are most highly likely. They dot vote on the left. And the ones that they think are the most impactful, they dot vote on the right. And they try to ignore what's on the left when they're doing what's on the right, and what's on the right when they're doing what's on the left. So forget about the impact when you're thinking about probability, only think about probability. So we do that. And then as you can see in this particular case, a subset of these risks were identified as the most, as the highest exposure. So then you can see that there's a backlog here. And what we do is we map those risks to the stories that we think that if we can deliver those stories, we will reduce the risk. And you can see that there are a couple of stories that have multiple risks associated with them. So what that means is that instead of just prioritizing our backlog or ranking our backlog by value and size, we also add risk into it, and we readjust our ranking based on risk. But we do it very explicitly. And I'll tell you what that results in. It results in a risk curve that looks like this. In our traditional or waterfall approach, we're just ready to go live with a beautiful product that we've delivered. And now the legal and compliance and risk people come in, and the marketing people, and they tell us why we can't go live, or the enterprise architects. But when we use this approach, we end up focusing on reducing risk. And every sprint, in our sprint review, we might actually have a little section where we talk about whether we reduced risks or not. And so we can focus on risk. And what that means is that on a traditional project, it's a terrible feeling at the end, where in an agile world, it's kind of a terrible feeling at the beginning. Because now we're thinking, oh gosh, these people just brought up all of these risks that we didn't think of when we created our backlog, and now we have to handle these things. And sometimes it means adding new user stories. Well, that's the whole point about shifting left. Let's add the new user stories early on so that we can handle the risks, instead of waiting until the end where it's too late. Now, this is something that I've done over and over again. And it's funny, my last work was at a bank here in Canada, and I worked at like 4.5 years ago. I called it Pessimistic Day. We did it. One of those pictures is of that bank. And then when I was working, I met with that team, and they don't call it Pessimistic Day anymore. They call it the Pessimist Session. And they still do the same thing. And they actually built a whole risk liaison team to work with product owners to make sure that all of the risks identified had some kind of control in place in the backlog. And it's very collaborative and proactive. And it's enabled that organization to deliver products much more quickly than they could in the past, when risk would be identified kind of throughout or at the end. Okay. There's a quiz now. Is everybody ready for the quiz?